I'll want to make a statement that warfare now has become very asymmetrical.
The nature of war itself is changing, right? And how war was waged has fundamentally changed over the last decade and a half.
It's been a turbulent / challenging sort of geopolitical context globally, right? We've had a bunch of conflicts across the world. The neighborhood situation and reality in India, especially with some of our neighbors, we need to be self-reliant. The overall defense budget's actually gone up to 7.8 lakh crores from the 6.8 lakh crores the year before. There's almost a 15% jump. FPV drones, which is first-person view kind of drones, which cost like $500, $700, $1,000, less than $1,000, causing harm and going and destroying tanks worth like $5-10 million right now. Now there's this level of non-linearity and asymmetric sort of nature, which is new, one has to contend with.
War becoming increasingly technology-led, becoming very asymmetric. I think that's exactly what a young tech-first team would want to think about, saying how can I have an asymmetric impact in just defending the country.
By 2029, where the procurement has to be indigenized for all of those categories. It's almost like someone's given you a cheat sheet saying this is what the country needs, is very important and like very critical.
Hey Ashray,
hey,
welcome.
Hi.
Super excited.
No, my mic is now on, working?
Now it's on.
Okay. It's just
Hello and welcome to the first episode of a new mini-series by Elevation Capital called Defending India. Over the course of the next few weeks, we'll be diving deep into this sector and try to unpack a few things, including what are some areas of excitement for us as a fund in this space, why do we believe that this is a very critical sector for India overall. We'll try and meet some founders who are building some exciting companies in this space, and also try and have conversations with a few experts who can help early teams figure out how to navigate this complex ecosystem of the government and the defense establishment. To make sense of all of this, today we have with us Ashray, who leads investments in this sector for us. Welcome, Ashray.
Thanks, Vishy. Excited to discuss this in more detail over the coming 1 hour.
Excellent. I'm super excited to dive deep into this. We've been speaking about this for a while. And even as we started discussing this a couple of weeks ago, I sort of realized that one of the more salient investment themes of the past few months has been the defense sector. And I was just looking at Google Trends, and if I looked at Google Trends, I looked up the term defense stocks, and the interest in that term has surged by 70% year on year and 200% over the last quarter. So clearly there seems to be something happening here. Defense is having its moment under the sun. If you were to take a step back and fundamentally understand what's happening in this space and what is driving so much of interest, what do you think are the driving factors behind the surge in interest for defense?
It's a very interesting question, something we've all been collectively at the fund also thinking through over the last couple of years, and we've had some time to at least go deep and try to make some more sense of it. So I think two things we should keep in mind, right? One is the wider geopolitical context around the world, and then more India-specific context here, right? And I'll go into both of them. So I think as we've all been seeing, it's been a turbulent / challenging sort of geopolitical context globally, right? We've had a bunch of conflicts across the world. We've had America take a very America first kind of approach in many dimensions, including like self-reliance, defense, and some of those areas. We've seen conflicts in the Europe, Russia, Ukraine, and more of those there play out, right? I think along with this whole global context plus the neighborhood situation and reality in India, especially with some of our neighbors, I think this has basically become all the more an important sort of area and field for everyone to think about, which is where I feel that sort of interest from common citizens and some of those has been increasing over the last year or so right now. I think what all of this basically leads to is there's a need for India and other countries to rethink how they think of defense readiness overall as a field in this whole evolving context. And within that context, I think two important sort of nuances for India to keep in mind, which is how do we be more ready and how are we more self-reliant in this sort of a context, given every country is sort of creating their own ecosystem and sort of prioritizing themselves versus a common alliance-based, organization-based sort of order right now. Over and above this, I think two things I think which are important to sort of call out. One is basically that historically, a lot of the global solutions on defense that India has been using, we realize may not be the right solutions for India. The India context is different in two ways. One, we have unique needs in the form of think through, like our terrain is very unique. We have heavy forests in some areas, we have very high altitude, thin air, thin oxygen kind of environments. So the kind of solutions we need will have to be very specific to India's unique context in all of those. And two, a lot of global systems and solutions may be produced with a certain cost structure in mind, which is very global in nature. For our unique needs, we need to find the right answers, which are, I would say, the most cost efficient for this context. And second one is, in the times of such conflict as every country prioritize themselves, we need to be self-reliant. Like the Prime Minister and the government have the vision of Atmanirbhar Bharat. It actually feeds in rightfully so here to make sure that we are ready, we are self-reliant at times of need where we don't need to depend on third parties to be able to help us out in those instances. So these are some of the key points that one has to keep in mind. Additionally, I feel a few more things sort of are interesting tailwinds for the space. So the first one is the push by the government to actually modernize our armed forces to be ready for all of this threat and get that readiness in order. And to do that, there have been a few things which have happened. One, the FDI, foreign direct investment in the space, is now been moved up to 74%. So there's a lot of global investment being welcomed into this space. Second one, there's a lot of at least encouragement and openness to work with private sector players and more so startups here, which also makes it quite interesting. And I think some of this is what we've seen, a combination of all of these global situations, context evolving, the government's push, our readiness, sort of culminating in a little bit of what you see, where I think if you look at a bunch of defense stocks, on an average over the last 5 years, they've all gone up 10x, which is vastly above where the indexes and the indices have sort of moved, right? And I think two key sort of variables that sort of drive this. One is there's core earnings growth itself, which is their profits have actually grown 3x. Additionally, the multiples like that they have been valued at have also gone up 3x, which leads to that multiplicative factor of almost 10, which is where things have moved, and investors are seeing the future potential in line with all of these sort of factors that we talked about, which has sort of led to what you talked about. So I actually think it's a very interesting time right now for India defense right now.
Understood. Very clear. Given that who we are trying to talk to through this series is largely going to be young teams, early entrepreneurs, I think for me as a little bit of an outsider in this segment, the fundamental question would be, how does a team that's building in this space even think about an ecosystem where it's largely just a one buyer, and that one buyer is the government, and hence, I'm not even quite sure how does a young founder think about navigating this sort of an ecosystem, right? So maybe also talk through how to navigate that and how our government spends, trends, etc. shifting.
It's a very fair question. Look, I think as investors, as we think through any field, the first thing we think through is market and the opportunity, right? So let me go deep and unpack some of that for you. So I'll maybe answer the questions in two parts. The first part you made, what that you asked was with respect to there being a single buyer, right? And oftentimes there's apprehension saying, oh, there's just one buyer, there's concentration and so on. Let me address that in one bit. And the other part is just the sheer opportunity itself, right? And we'll decouple both of those. Maybe I'll answer the single buyer part first. And while by and large it is true that there's a single buyer, which is, let's say, the Ministry of Defense right now, the stakeholders for whom a lot of these purchases are happening are actually slightly different. The large ones are, of course, the armed forces, and there we have the army, we have the navy, we have the air force. Each of these three have their own needs, own sort of procurement sort of methods and approaches to some of those. So to that extent, I would say there are three such buyers within the key stakeholders, the armed forces. Then we also have a lot of our paramilitary forces. Think of the Border Security Force, CISF, a lot of the police forces as well for certain of their divisions, all of whom may also have need and requirement for a bunch of these systems. So to that extent, I feel the buyers are fairly heterogeneous, while there is a large concentration for the armed forces. Apart from this, I also think there's an interesting use case on exports here. The government's actually been very supportive and very encouraging of exports from India for defense. So I think those are also stakeholders, and we see a bunch of companies actually been able to do that as well. So to that extent, I hope this clarifies the part around the buyer ecosystem and the fact that it's not single, but it's spread across all of those. Now coming to the core question on the opportunity size itself, right? I don't know if you had a chance to look at the recent budget announcement that we had earlier this month. And I would say, in fact, defense got a lot of focus and a lot of emphasis in that budget, and maybe I can walk through some key figures there. So at least for the coming year, FY 26-27, right, the overall defense budget's actually gone up to 7.8 lakh crores from the 6.8 lakh crores the year before. There's almost a 15% jump, which is very, very steep jump, honestly. Second, of all the ministries, MOD has the highest budget right now. Of this overall budget, right, the budget for capital, which is largely used for modernization, has actually gone up from 1.8 lakh crores to 2.2 lakh crores, which has actually gone up higher than the rate at which the overall budget has improved, 25% jump. And of this 2.2 lakh crores, 75% has actually been earmarked for domestic procurement, in line with the Atmanirbhar Bharat point that we made earlier, right? This number used to actually be closer to 58-60% almost a decade back, but has slowly been inching up in lines with increasing our self-reliance, which is quite interesting. And of this whole 75% pool we have, 25 to 30,000 crores is ballpark earmarked for a lot of private sector firms and startups. The remaining goes to our defense PSUs like HAL, BEL, BDL and others. But this 25-30,000 crore pool is a net new pool that's available, which was not available before. And actually, the rationale that the government has is a whole sets of needs here, which are only likely to be best fulfilled in the right cost, right speed and the right specs by the private sector and by sort of startups here, which is where this comes in. So in my view, it's a very interesting sort of opportunity that's very large right now. So I'm quite excited about that. And interestingly, like one example here that I was actually reading a couple of days ago, I think 2-3 days ago, there was a news article that actually talked about the AMCA fighter jet program that we have. And historically, HAL has been the primary sort of vendor for this. And in the recent, at least the process is still ongoing, but it looks like the top 3 contenders were still in running are 3 private sector players here, which is like Tata, L&T and Bharat Forge. So I feel the opportunity is quite real, both from an intent standpoint and from just the clear budget availability standpoint right now, which makes the opportunity very, very exciting, both for the country and for startups.
Clear. So key trends that are almost themes that seem to be converging are modernization, self-reliance, indigenization, and also push for private, and within that an increased amount of attention for startups.
Absolutely.
Right? So I think great convergence of trends for, again, early teams building in the space.
Correct.
Looking to really help with the agenda of self-reliant India on defense. What I want to dive next into is to then figure out what are these spaces where founders can be building companies in. But before we get to that, I think it's important to just understand the fact that the nature of war itself is changing, right? And how war was waged and how countries thought about defense has fundamentally changed over the last decade and a half. It'll be great to understand from you some of those core principles or frameworks we are seeing in which war is changing. And hence, what does that mean for somebody who's building in this space?
No, it's a fascinating question and a very important one to sort of understand before we think through more deeper questions on the space, right? Like the example I will like to maybe use here is when we use any popular media as an example, right? Movies, films or TV shows. A lot of way war is shown is very people first, right? There's large numbers of people on battlefields and things like those. I feel we have come a long way from then. And the use of technology and the warfare tactics today vastly different from what things were earlier, right? Maybe to point out the extremities, I'd want to use 1 or 2 examples, which is that I'll want to make a statement that warfare now has become very asymmetrical. And let me explain what I mean by that, right? If we look at the Russia-Ukraine conflict right now, we have been seeing a lot of let's say FPV drones, which is first person view kind of drones, which cost like $500, $700, $1,000, less than $1,000, causing harm and going and destroying tanks worth like $5-10 million right now. So the cost to impact ratio you can think of is almost 3,000 to 5,000 times. Like it's very asymmetric to that regard, right? Earlier one would think of all of this as very proportional. Like I spend X, something X get destroyed. Now there's this level of non-linearity and asymmetric sort of nature, which is new, one has to contend with. And in a lot of these cases, this completely changed how people have to respond to this, how people have to be prepared for something like this. I would say that's a big push and tailwind that we're seeing around us right now. So that's one. Similarly, in those contexts, we have seen these undersea drones and undersea sort of vessels going and sort of destroying tankers and all of those, largely where few $1,000s worth equipment can now destroy millions of dollars worth of equipment. If you see the recent conflict that India had with one of our neighbors, the same thing that we contended here was these large swarms of low-cost drones which were originally made in Turkey, China and things like those, for which we had to use and deploy like serious equipment to do it. This begs the question saying that how does one approach some of this asymmetric nature of this warfare? And I think the point there is how does one build more proportional and like more staggered levels of responses? How do we have the right tech interventions and tech solutions for each kind of threat? Maybe it's not a one size fits all. You actually use different kinds of solutions with different cost bases, with different specs to go approach this wide range of spectrum. So I think that's the first one. What this would mean is again having more deeper tech systems, more granular systems, and it's I would say the force multiplier on top of humans. Like humans are still a very core part of warfare, but in a way, if I can say this, we are preserving human life, adding a force multiplier on top through technology, through all of these systems, both hardware plus software, to actually make each of them that much more effective. And I feel that's the core dynamic that we have to contend with, which also creates a very interesting opportunity in that modernization push and the indigenization push that we talked about, which I think is a very exciting theme for startups to focus on.
Understood. Super exciting. I think then tying this all together, war becoming increasingly technology-led, becoming very asymmetric, I think that's exactly what a young tech-first team would want to think about, saying how can I have an asymmetric impact in just defending the country and creating systems that can integrate with the defense establishment and really help secure the country.
100%. So the one point maybe I'll add here, I missed adding, was we talked a lot about the response nature here, right? Yeah. There's also preparedness angle here. So preparedness, like we call ISR, right? Intelligence, surveillance and reconnaissance. Very core dimension of warfare as well. The emphasis on ISR and tech-led ISR becomes all the more real in this new warfare sort of world right now. Correct. And I feel the role is one, if something happens, what do you do? And we spoke about a couple of options of how people can think through that. Second is how do you be more ready? Yeah. And I feel the role for tech and for startups actually spans both of them in very interesting ways. And I think in the rest of the discussion, we can go into more detail there, but that I think paints a more holistic picture of the sort of...
And even this point you're making of ISR, right? Especially, and if I tie it back to what you were saying of India's unique sort of terrain, right? If you tie the fact that we have a unique terrain and hence even the sort of technology that we need on surveillance and the sort of, whether it is robots or drones that we needs to operate in a very different sort of set of environments than 100%. What could be globally available. So again, opportunity for Indian companies.
So sharing an anecdote. So I was speaking with a couple of folks who were retired from the service, and a view that we often get, and we also hear this when we speak on, like, let's say a bunch of talks, expert sort of conversations that happen on the subject in different dialogues and so on, is that when we actually when we use a lot of global solutions, when we take them to, let's say, Kashmir or some of those areas which are very high altitude, very thin air, a lot of those global solutions fail, or the specs at which they were supposed to be working don't actually hold up in these realities right now. When the temperatures vary that much, the level of oxygen in the air changes so much, and you don't have the kind of infrastructure that can support how they were being used or designed for, You need very original net new approaches. So a lot of these global solutions don't work in those contexts of like that 20,000 feet altitude, this oxygen concentration, massive weather changes. Like in India, you can actually see weathers of like 50 degrees in the summer and like minus 40, minus 50 in the winter. So you have to contend an extremely wide range of temperature, altitude, terrain, and you have to balance the right cost needs, which like a growing country like us needs to be mindful of. So I think that creates a very interesting opportunity.
Super, very clear and very exciting. So then maybe let's unpeel a little bit of what those possible sectors can be, right? We have spoken a little bit about drones, and I think that seems to be capturing a large part of the zeitgeist when it comes to modern warfare is equal to drones, which I think is true to an extent, but it's a lot more than just that, right? So it'd be great if you can unpack not just the drone opportunity in India, and I think even within that there's a little bit of a spectrum, but also what are the other areas we see young teams can create these asymmetrical companies?
Correct. I think it's a very fair question, something we have given a lot of thought to, and we have met a lot of startups across all of these spaces, and we have spoken to a lot of folks in the service, folks who have retired from the service to form a point of view. I think, in my view, let's talk about drones first. I think in other terms, they're also called as UAVs, unmanned aerial vehicles, right? People prefer whatever nomenclature that they do. Drone is a more colloquial sort of nomenclature. UAV is what like the folks in the service also use. So when we think of UAVs as a category as well, right? I would ask us to think through and break it down into a few segments there. We talked about ISR briefly, which is the surveillance, intelligence sort of category and use case here. The second one is cargo, and the third one I would say is combat. So let's think of the opportunity across all these three. And I feel all three are very, very interesting sort of categories, because it goes back to that core theme of making soldiers and our current armed forces that much more productive. So like think of a use case like in a difficult area, difficult terrain. Would you want to risk a soldier's life, or would you rather use a low-cost intelligent system coupled with smart hardware and software to be able to project their view and reach over a longer distance to be able to get that input? ISR is the most common, easy to deploy use case, which has already been, I would say, in action for the last almost 10 to 12 years, where we're seeing a bunch of startups actually make inroads and actively being used. So now I would say ISR is a core part of the doctrine and already adopted and being used. Cargo is a very interesting category, where if you think of it, the armed forces, given the altitudes we talked about, the terrains we talked about, actually use mules in a lot of cases for actually transport of key goods. And they always say, right, like an army is only as good as its supply line and its operational sort of supply capabilities. So some of those are very important for us from a capability and resilience standpoint. And being able to mules are great and fantastic in a lot of contexts, but some cases, as the crow flies, a drone might be able to go much faster versus like, let's say, mules having to go up mountains and taking days to go do that and getting tired and so on. So those are very interesting kind of solutions that we are seeing. And the last one I would say is combat, which is where everything right from like kamikaze drones, which are like the ones we talked about in Ukraine, right? The ones which are single use, you just go detonate, explode a payload or whatever you need, right? Makes it very interesting versus having to use people or soldiers for something like that. And to all the way up to more complex systems like our mail and hail. Mail are medium altitude, long endurance. Hail are high altitude, long endurance. These are like, think of the example which is more popular is like the Predator class drones, and all of those are important as a part of the arsenal. So right now we're seeing intent and procurement happening at all ends of the spectrum across all of these categories, which makes it a very, very interesting category. Because this is also, I would say, the more obvious ones and the more proven one. We've also seen a lot of venture funding. Almost 60 to 70% of all funding has gone in these categories, rightfully so. And the procurements here across even just domestic players, startups have already been in like between the 1,000 to 10,000 crore range over the last few years. And we only see some of that accelerating and improving over time, basically. So that's one large category. The second big category in our view for startups, which is exciting, is defense electronics. We talked about how warfare is changing, right? A few ways and few examples in which some of this warfare changes. One is if, let's say, someone's trying to send drones over onto our side, we try to jam those or try to prevent those from coming, or being able to prevent them from being effective or communicate back with their base. Second one of this is actually what we call electronic warfare, where you're able to detect this more passively without giving away your position, more active kind of detection using radars and things like those. So across all forms of detection, stopping, and an ancillary theme around maybe simulations and all of those, we feel there are very interesting categories. So this whole defense electronics, because this marries two subsystems and two kinds of capabilities, right? One is core electronics capabilities, second is software. Because being able to visualize all of this in a nice way, in an integrated way, is very critical. The way warfare has also changed is from more siloed solo approaches to more integrated approaches, saying can we have feeds and data coming in from a variety of stations, variety of locations, can our response be very coordinated across large pieces of geography, across commands and all of those. So this whole defense electronics is quite interesting, and within that, anti-drone systems or counter UAV systems are very exciting as a theme, and here you see options something like soft kill. Soft kill are basically options which use like radio frequencies and high energy RF to be able to jam some of these drones from being able to come over here or be able to communicate effectively. The second one is more hard kill, which requires something like an interception. That could you like send another small piece of drone to go collide against it and take it off course or take it down, or could you use things like lasers and all of those to go be able to attempt some of those.
Instead of the $1 million missiles that we have.
Exactly. So some of this is quite interesting. And to be able to do this effectively is this detection layer, which is where are you able to detect more softly, are you detect across bands, are you able to do all of those, are very interesting sort of areas and opportunities. And because these marry modern tech capabilities, I feel startups are very well positioned to go attack something like this, and a lot of existing large incumbents may not be that much further ahead in the journey in terms of tech or capability, which actually allows startups to actually use agility, use that capability to go build these holistic solutions which marry multiple kind of capabilities which are well suited for the strengths that startups usually have. So this is one category, and we touched briefly upon the simulation category, right? Like today we have large kind of systems we have, like could be fighter jets, could be other missile systems. If one has to test and prepare, you would not want to use these very expensive systems to go do testing because it costs money, right? Yeah. What are more thoughtful, creative and frugal ways to be able to achieve the same objective without doing that? So actually doing a lot of simulation testing, and some of those are very interesting areas, and we're seeing a bunch of startups emerge there. And it again attacks the same opportunity of being able to marry two complex capabilities, which is maybe hardware systems and software systems, and being able to bring them together in very interesting ways, right? Which are areas which I think startups can excel at. So some of those have been quite interesting. And maybe the last theme is, I'll just go back to saying, I'd like to call it maybe soldier productivity or soldier supercharging, which is like think of soldiers who may be using guns. Can you equip them with smarter sights on top of those, which can sort of help them acquire targets better, or basically thermal imaging cameras and things like those, which give you more data, more inputs to be able to operate and do your job better. So any forms of productivity which just amplifies your capability, I feel could be very interesting. And again here, these marry the right hardware, software kind of systems to be able to do a great job. And given that these are, I would say, low to mid complexity kind of categories, startups I think are very well positioned to go attack something like this. So these are some of the categories we feel are quite exciting right now.
Wow, this is like really interesting. And just the number of opportunities hence there exists for a company to be building in this space. Leverage what I think is uniquely Indian strengths around especially software, but also technology, hardware, bring it all together. And the fact that we feel that some of these early teams might not be that far away from folks who have been around doing this for a few years. I think that's a big revelation.
Given the rate at which warfare itself has been changing, like incumbents have a head start.
Maybe that's what makes the opportunity itself. The fact that it's changing so much.
Correct.
So the classic innovator's dilemma will
100%
help startup.
And look, rightfully so, because this balances the needs. There are ultra sensitive, ultra complex sort of categories also, for which maybe a different set of sort of folks are better suited to attack something like those. But for a lot of the categories we talked about, which are in that low to mid complexity category, still very critical, and where speed is of essence, I feel those opportunities are very well suited for startups to actually go attack and win.
Very interesting. Talking about attacking and winning, for a founder, winning the contracts is probably also equally important, if not more. And I guess for a builder in this space, we spoke a little bit about how it is not a single buyer sort of system, but the fact would probably still remain, or at least the perception would remain, that it's a largely, rule bound, long timelines, bureaucratic sort of process through which all of these arms go about doing the procurement or evaluation of startups. Is that assessment accurate? Do you think things have changed? Do you think we've become a lot more entrepreneurial from the government side when it comes to just the procurement decisioning on this?
Most definitely so. So the view that you talked about, which is there being more opaqueness, not as clear processes, taking a long time, I think that was the norm like maybe a decade back or earlier, right? Now, what we basically see is that as threats have changed, as things have changed, and this modernization process and indigenization process is underway, I think the government has actually simplified the process quite a bit, and is actually super encouraging, honestly. And like, think of it right now. Earlier, what would be like a closed RFP, request for sort of proposal to a small set of people, the wider world would not know. Now you have things like the GEM portal, where a lot of these RFIs, RFPs are put out, anyone can see, basis the eligibility criteria, people can apply. A lot of the decision making is very transparent right now. And there are these bidding processes, reverse auction processes, all of those which actually just increase and simplify the whole process with a lot of tech. If I can just maybe take a minute to explain how the process works for a bunch of our viewers, right? Usually, in a lot of these cases, the needs are aggregated from different pieces in the armed forces, different units, different sort of segments, and they're all aggregated all the way to the top. And basis that for some of these needs which are prioritized, you basically put out these RFIs, which are requests for information. This is largely to check, saying, look, for some needs like those, do we have the capability in the country today that could be produced? Can it be produced in a cost-effective way? Can it be produced with the right kind of longevity that we want? Can it be produced the right kind of quality that we want? Basis a lot of the RFIs, the inputs are taken back. The procurement teams in the armed forces usually then come back, and actually once the needs are fulfilled and the units and the number of quantities and all are locked in, they also figure out who is an anchor customer in here, which is which unit, which regiment may use this. There's a sponsor. Then you lock in saying that, okay, we'll procure this. You will be responsible for the success of something like this, right? You then put out RFPs for something like this, which are more specific, more detailed, have clearer sort of guidelines and all of those. And basis RFPs, you do trials. And oftentimes these trials are field trials. And field trials, a bunch of like sort of players are invited basis capability or people who responded to some of these RFIs. And basis the RFP, you actually qualify people on the technical aspect, saying you shortlist a few people who are the few ones who meet the technical eligibility criteria. And on those, you then run the L1 process, which is saying who is the cheapest and so on. Some cases there could also be reverse auction processes to make sure if the two bids are very close and all of those to be able to nail down the price. So there's a lot of transparency right now, and all of this happens in a fairly fast way. And speaking of fast, it's important to call out one important mechanism that the government's been using over the last 5-6 years more actively is the emergency procurement, or what is called EP in the circles, right? So EP, if I explain in more simple terms, is just institutionalizing agility. So while a lot of the processes for these large systems rightfully take a fairly long time, because you're actually buying something that needs to outlast our lives in some way and has to stay good for an extended period of time, the processes are also more burdensome and are heavy for that, right? What EP simplifies is for essential things that you need right now, which may not be as critical or maybe low, mid complexity in all of those. You have a fast track procurement process. You have fewer trials, you have fewer steps in the process, and the time from like need to purchase can actually be within a few months. Whereas for capital procurement, which is the more default form of long-term procurement, it could actually in some cases go from a year to few years as well. So this has actually really allowed the armed forces to respond to this changing dynamic globally and respond with speed, and which has also been the mechanism through which a lot of startups have been able to showcase their capabilities and win those early orders and start moving forward, right? So this has actually been a game changer, both for the country and for the startup ecosystem here. And the part we should keep in mind though is beyond this, the government's also launched a bunch of other schemes. So we've heard of IDEX, we've heard of Aditi, we've heard of Make 1, Make 2. all of these are schemes under which government's actually allowing startups to come pick certain areas of problems, actually solve. In things like Aditi, there's a 25 crore grant from the government for make one kind of projects, up to a 250 crore cap. The MOD actually funds 70% of the project. So in all of those, actually there's being room made for more startups to come in into the fold, for the procurement part to be easier, and for these to be the vehicles to get into the consideration set for a lot of critical categories, right? So I feel it actually opens up a field for a wide set of stakeholders to actually participate, and capital may no longer be a constraint. Capital seems to be available in fair amounts right now. So I feel the playing field has leveled massively in the right categories that we spoke about earlier. Beyond this, the additional tailwind here is there's something called a positive indigenization list. So there's almost 5,000 critical systems, subsystems and components which have been put on a positive indigenization list by 2029, where the procurement has to be indigenized for all of those categories. Now it's almost like someone's given you a cheat sheet saying this is what the country needs, is very important and like very critical. So those are the roadmaps that startups can start working off to say that how do we start working on some of those. So the mix of intent, process simplification, transparency, and the right kind of capital being funded via a lot of these grants, schemes, and these kind of lists, I think the opportunity and the procurement now is a much, much straighter process that a lot of startups can actually participate in.
Awesome. I think, as you said, a lot of this processes being put in place, but I think the most important thing that I heard from all of this is institutionalizing agility, right? I think that's the big culture change that we need to see, and that I think what I hear from you is already happening across the entire defense establishment. I think that's going to be that's already been a bit of a game changer, but I think over the next decade, 2 decades, that's what is going to be, really that tailwind that startups need.
Correct.
Which then brings me to the next question for me is, for us then as a team, as we meet companies or as we're speaking to founders who are building in this space, what is a little bit of framework we have for what does a good team in this space look like, or what does it take for a team to win in this space?
It's a very fair question, and I think a few key factors stand out for us. So one, I think, is maybe let's talk about the team itself, right? Given that I still feel this is a technical field and tech innovation differentiation is very critical at this stage, being able to balance the right specs with the right cost and performance longevity, while being able to, of course, work with stakeholders across the armed forces and all of those, which is not an easy task. While there's a lot of simplification, it requires like small startup working with an extremely large stakeholder who may have a lot of processes and all of those will still require certain capabilities. So I feel that teams that marry both tech capability and GTM capability are very, very important. Being good at one, which is knowing how the stakeholders on the buyer side work, is just one part of the puzzle. Teams which are great at that but poor at tech, either license tech from someone else or like hire other people to do that, I feel long term have a weaker chance. You may get some early wins, but long term difficult to make it work. Same vice versa, you may have a great product, it may end up remaining a science experiment without being able to marry the buyer side feedback, being able to make the right tweaks, being able to participate in these processes and navigate through all of those to get it done. So I feel that you need that rare combination and that special combination of being able to marry both of these sort of skill sets, right? So that's one very important part. The second one is to actually pick more high IP categories and more high, I would say, differentiation categories, because those are one in which you can, the need is more acute, willingness to pay a premium for a differentiated product is higher, and ability to defend margins over an extended period of time. Given that in any form of procurement where there is like this technical plus L1 kind of a process where there's cost level bidding process, over time costs get bid down, right? So for you to defend margins, it's important that you protect a category in which the technical difference exists, where that margins can be defended for an extended period of time. So for example, in some categories of UAVs, drones right now, the tech has fairly been democratized globally right now. Like those are not maybe the highest differentiation categories right now. So hence margins and some of those are under pressure in those categories, and it will be tough to defend them over a period of time. But picking more high IP categories, there's some special forms of ISR, more of this, let's say, male hail kind of UAV kind of categories, and this is not an exhaustive list, but I'm just giving you a few examples to make the point, are places where those high IP, high margins can sort of be done, right? Or in the defense electronics side, we talked about there could be certain forms of robotics, certain forms of counter drone systems where that IP can actually come and shine, which will allow you to sort of serve more acute needs, which will also smoothen and fast track all your processes, and to allow you to defend margins and sort of make a good return at the same time. Apart from this, I would say the other one, we talked about defense super cycles, right? It leads to an interesting point here that a lot of these procurements happen in cycles. As doctrines shift, you will fix missing areas in a certain theme, and which is why a lot of procurement ends up being thematic in a few areas at a few points in time. Now, once the procurement for those areas has been completed to a reasonable degree and you have gotten to a certain level of reliance, you may not want to continue investing in that beyond a point. The marginal utility there is quite low. So in such cases, while there are AMC kind of revenue streams that may exist for a longer period of time, replacement revenue streams, it's important for you to find new revenue streams, which is where the point we talked about, which is teams which span capabilities across 2-3 areas, which is hardware and software, or mechanical systems and electronic systems. All of those allow you to extend those capabilities into new product areas. So think of 3-year, 4-year, 5-year kind of cycles where certain themes get more procured, but post that if you have a robust R&D pipeline where you're developing the products for the next capability and having that product catalog which spans, I would say, more systems, more capabilities, will make it more immune to the cyclical nature of some of these procurements, which is because those are the things that are important to go build an enduring company, an enduring sort of franchise here. And I think that skill set is a non-trivial one. So being able to set yourself up from a design choice standpoint, saying those are the kind of capabilities we build and here is the kind of catalog we build over a period of time, becomes very important to actually go build an enduring company here. So thematically, I would say these are a few areas and few themes that we have been looking at. And we have been quite encouraged with the kind of quality of teams that are attempting to build in this space. We are seeing teams actually migrate back from countries abroad to come build for India in some of these areas. Now that the intent exists, the revenue pool exists, and that sort of budget exists, we are seeing the right kind of teams rise up to the challenge and actually come build here. So we have been quite excited with the kind of people we are meeting, and we're excited to meet more.
Nice. I think that pretty much, wraps up our discussion for today. We'll continue to go deeper over the next few weeks in this topic, because when we started talking about doing this, we realized that maybe we might not be able to do justice with just one episode, right? So as I said earlier, we'll try to catch hold of some founders who are building exciting things here. We'll try to talk to some experts.
Correct.
Who can give us their point of view of how to just, navigate through the procurement or the overall defense establishment ecosystem. And if you are a team that's building in this space, keep watching. Do reach out to us, reach out to Ashray and team. We would love to chat with you and understand what you're building and see where we can add a little bit of value to you. Keep watching this space. Thank you.